You're listening to KZIC Voces, Críticas, Critical Voices. I started with a few different tunes to my show tonight in honor of the Queen, Aretha Franklin. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight to Voces Críticas. I'm excited to tell you that I've got Dr. Liz Philipose on the line, and she's here to talk to us about spirituality and politics. Dr. Philipose studies and teaches for transformation as a professor of women's studies and global politics. She's published several articles on some of the darkest aspects of the human condition to deepen our understanding of the ways the social world creates separation between us. Liz is an agent of healing and transformation, and she guides us to know that we have the capacity to heal and transform our lives. Hi, Liz. Welcome to KZSC's Voces Críticas.
Hi, Silvana. Thank you so much for having me. Glad to be here.
I'm glad that you are here with us. And on what a day, the passing of the great Aretha Franklin. How are you feeling today about the passage of the Queen?
Well, she's Queen of the Soul. I just am reminded of what an amazing example she is of someone giving great expression to her divine genius, of getting out of her way, her own way, to allow that to pour through her. We're all gifted, we're all talented, but the difference is when someone like Aretha is able to just allow that to flow. She really shows us something amazing and awe-inspiring. So I'm just in celebration of a magnificent life, of a life lived so well, and in expression of who she really is, her authenticity.
I think that's absolutely spot on. The other piece that I sort of take away in thinking about her life is her profound love for Black people. This was a woman who walked the walk, talked the talk, and we are better for having part of her in our life. I want us to first start talking about, as we think through questions of spirituality and politics, this relationship between secularism and spirituality and what you think secularly oriented people misunderstand about the power and the promise of spirituality.
Well, I think what happens often is that there's a conflation of spirituality and religion. And I think those are separate things. So religion is organizations that come together around a set of beliefs that becomes a belief system that establishes boundaries between what we believe and what we don't believe, and offers values for living that people adhere to because they pledge a certain kind of loyalty or allegiance to an institution. And so, religion can take us to spirituality because at the core of it is some sense of the transcendent. But I don't think, it exhausts all possibilities. I think spirituality is a much broader, much more universal quality. And I would say we're all spiritual beings, not because we have allegiance to a particular belief system, but because we are energy condensed into form, because we're more than our bodies and minds, because we're also, some might say, souls, that we're also something inside of us that is greater than our physicality, than our materiality, that can't necessarily be quantified, and yet we can know that we have an intrinsic connection to life, that there's something about us that is universal, that there's something about us that is transcendent and that connects us to all of life. And so, spirituality, I think, refers then to the etheric bodies, the subtle bodies, the transcendent nature of life, or the interconnectedness of us all, the oneness of us that comes because we come from one life, that principle of universal life. I think in that sense, spirituality is the quality of our existence that we all have, differently experienced depending on where our attention is.
I think, too, right now about the sort of political moment in which there's a crisis literally every single day, every single hour, it seems like. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the current political climate, in some ways, or maybe not, has challenged your ability to sort of retain that spiritual centeredness that we all, as you say, have within us.
I mean, we all have that, and then it's very easy to lose sight of. And I think, a number of people have commented on the fact that what we suffer from most is really a spiritual deficit, meaning a disconnection from each other, a disconnection from our authentic selves. And I think it's the same disconnection that Karl Marx talked about when he talked about alienation, a sense of alienation or a sense of separation from our creative essence. or our species being the universal. So I would say, that is what we're challenged with right now, that the things that we're seeing appear in public discourse are expressions of separation. They're expressions of a spiritual deficit, a disconnection from each other as part of one life. And we suffer from that disconnection within ourselves to find our grounding, to find our central values or our universal principles, to find where it is that we stand in this moment when we're being buffeted around every day, like you say, by one crisis after another. And so I think we're challenged as political people or progressive thinkers or whoever we are in this moment that has a sensation of being concerned about where we're headed and concerned for a greater good, that we're challenged to find our way through to seeing some shared values and universal principles to counter that spiritual deficit. One thing I could also say is from that kind of alienation that we experience within our own selves, that very often then our responses are coming from not from centeredness, but from emotionality or reactiveness. And part of what we're seeing unfold wants us to be every day in crisis, wants us to feel emotionally unstable, right? It's part of the weapons of mass distraction. Every single day something occurs that shakes us. And when we're responding or reacting from high emotions and fear and anger, we're reacting from that fight or flight part of us. So I think we're challenged. We're challenged to work with our emotional bodies and our reactive side, right, to find some peaceful center, some core of us that anchors us, that grounds us.
I wondered if we could think about how this disconnect that you're talking about is in many ways impeding the possibility, the potential of a more radical invocation of social movements in the U.S. in particular.
At a very just sort of basic level, if social movements are interested in creating communities where everybody has the ability to be themselves, to be dignified, and have the conditions that support each of us to bring our gifts and talents. That's a kind of communitarian conversation that has a hard time getting off the ground when we're coming from a sense of separation that might be unconscious. So consciously, we might be talking about building communities in which we're all supported, but unconscious, we haven't addressed our own internal separation or alienation, so we can't really land that. I think, one thing that we don't really work with directly in our organizations or talk about directly is the way that ego plays out and our ego personality, which by definition is a sense of separation. To be in our ego personalities and allow that to lead, we miss our central values of community building and dignity and justice and find ourselves engaged with more turf struggles or power struggles or whatever else it is. If some other thing has got us in these organizations or these movements, some other thing is moving us rather than our desire to see us connect. What shows up in the world is really the expression, the outcome of consciousness. And consciousness is something that we have dominion over because we're each an aspect of the collective consciousness. And so if I heal my sense of separation and all the ways that it plays out in me, then what I'm expressing in the world comes from that healing, and that changes the collective.
You're listening to Dr. Liz Philipose, who studies and teaches for transformation and healing. Her life's work is to guide us to know that we have the capacity to heal and transform our lives. Now, Liz, in your work, you talk about this transformation and healing from the inside out, and you were just sort of talking a little bit about some of the work that we have to do, but can you talk a little bit more about why the transformation is from the inside out and what you mean specifically about the urgency of this transformation?
Consciousness precedes form. And so what shows up as our political institutions and our ways of organizing ourselves comes from a certain collective consciousness, what kind of governs us in the last few hundred years is a consciousness of scarcity, an assumption and a set of assumptions and institutions built around the idea that there's not enough to go around. An economic system that is founded on the assumption of scarcity, and our fear and greed is what keeps it producing, keeps it moving. It's a consciousness of separation that shows up in terms of borders and boundaries, the assumption that within state is unity and outside state are threats and risks. That's a collective consciousness that gets hooked and triggered in all sorts of ways. You can see the immigration conversation, for instance, that triggers it. The consciousness of otherness, that if you grow up in a divided, fragmented society based on the idea that there's a hierarchy of humanity and that we are intrinsically, genetically, biologically different from each other and different in ways that are threatening, that gets encoded in us. That, prejudice and bigotry, that's a whole visual apparatus. It's a way of seeing. It's instantaneous information that we learn how to receive and interpret long before we even have words for seeing it. This stuff is all lodged in us. The political is very much lodged in us. The divisions between races and gender and nations very much lodged in us, in our perceptual apparatus. And so that's where the inner work, I think, happens if we're talking politically, right, is to take seriously the ways that prejudices and bigotry circulate in me. And how can I find my way to seeing people whole? I have to see myself whole for that to happen. I think for activists or anybody, in this society, it's hard to grow up here without internalizing all of that, right? The sense of separation that shows up as gender, race, nation, sexuality, etc. And so every one of us has something to exorcise, right, that keeps us thinking that we're separate and keeps us then manipulable. We're easy to manipulate when fear-based discourse is circulating, when the idea of outsiders are coming to take away something from us. We're easy, right, targets for manipulation when we're not healed at that level of separation. So that's part of it, transforming from the inside out, becoming different agents of this society, becoming agents of transformation through raising our own consciousness. And we raise the collective consciousness. And, of course, everything that we do that comes from a consciousness of oneness or wholeness is different than what comes from a consciousness of separation.
For those people who are maybe struggling with everything that's happening around us in terms of trying to be centered and maintain a well-being, as sort of a closing thoughts, what advice would you give around caring for themselves and well-being?
I think meditation is a crucial technology, especially as things are so chaotic and jangly and that there's hard to get a moment of silence and clarity. That meditation as a practice allows us access to ground and anchor in our authentic selves, and so it makes us stronger. It makes us less manipulable, and it connects something that's true and authentic about ourselves. We get more assuredness and confidence from being anchored in our authentic selves. So I'd say for everybody, meditation. If you already meditate more. Things are heating up in unprecedented ways. We need to up-level our practices. I think the other thing is that we have a bigger knowledge, an expanded knowledge of who we are and how we got here, that we get clear about the truth of our histories that bring us here to this moment. So we get some perspective.
Well, thank you so much, Liz, for spending some time with us today on Voces Críticas.